Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
Kerry Clack, columnist, editorial board.
Nancy Pryor-Johnson, deputy editorial board editor.
Metro editor Greg Jefferson.
Today we're going to talk about funding for SA 2020. We're going to talk about the poet Nephtalí De León. We're going to talk about libraries and librarians in public schools. Before we do that, I wanted to mention quickly that there was a Republican presidential debate last Wednesday. There were 8 candidates on stage. They did not include the obvious frontrunner, former President Donald Trump, who just chose not to be there. The group also did not include Helotes-based former Congressman Will Hurd, who very much wanted to be there. And he met the qualification for the number of donors needed. You had to have 40,000 individual donors. He got that. He did not reach the threshold for as far as poll numbers in the polls that were approved by the Republican National Committee. So he didn't make it. He was very unhappy about that. The person who ended up getting the most attention was entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy. Tommy Tuberville had a lot of trouble with his first name the other day, I was noticing. But
Tommy Tuberville has a lot of problems with it.
Had a lot of problems in general. Yeah. But Ramaswamy, it was interesting. He's I think he's little smug, maybe a little likes himself a little kind of glib, maybe. Is that fair? But he had a lot of like one-liners and kind of zingers that he was throwing at the other candidates. But he praised Trump so much. I find myself kind of wondering, well, what was the real point in being in the race if you're saying this is the greatest president of the 21st century and he's running, but yet I'm running against him. I'm not sure. But Will Hurd did have a statement about that where he said that he described Ramaswamy as a pretty bad lounge act of Donald Trump. So we had that. Also want to mention, before we get into our main topics, that last Thursday, there were serious threats of rolling blackouts in San Antonio because we've had this extreme heat and energy usage was on the verge of exceeding capacity. Quick question for the group. I mean, the fact that we didn't have rolling blackouts do we look at that and think, well, this is a positive sign that our grid is functioning as it's supposed to, or do we look at it and say, okay, I'm the master of the obvious question, or do we say
it was an act of God because there was a big storm in the Houston area that knocked out. I mean, it cooled off the Houston area.
Yeah.
So less demand coming out of East Texas, and it knocked 60,000 electricity customers offline. That helped.
Yeah.
That was it.
So although actually that's a form of conservation, I guess.
Yeah. So, but I mean, if you look, because I was following the supply demand curve pretty closely that afternoon, and you could, beginning at mid afternoon, they put out calls for conservation. They, they mandated for city governments, start phasing out power usage in your buildings, and you could actually see that working a little bit. I mean, it got a teensy bit. There was just a little bit more margin as you approach 650, which was really kind of the witching hour.
I think people were kind of scared and were trying to get back a little bit.
Yeah. But I mean, really,
actually,
it probably
I saw
came down
a meme that said, cut back, and then they said, okay, everybody went down to like 50 on their thermostat to try to make it colder to trap the air in their
Oh my
house.
God.
Like, I really hope not, y'all. Like, turn it up. I was super nervous. My husband actually I said, oh my gosh, like, I don't know what we need to do, but charge everything and whatever. I was nervous, like I don't like the heat. And, that would have been a really uncomfortable.
Yeah. The only reason I asked the question is because in fairness to ERCOT, and we know the problems they've had in the past. I mean, the temperatures have been insane this summer and the energy usage has been unbelievable. So
totally. And I mean, the only thing surprising is that this didn't come sooner in the season.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, because it was like the 60th. Is it the 60th day over 100?
That's right.
60 days.
That was on Thursday, right?
A lot of them over 105. And I mean, we're still dealing with it. I mean, what we're talking about, those threats we could be dealing with that this week.
There's wind turbines right when you get to Mathis, which is my hometown. So you're going south on 281-37, and there's wind turbines as soon as you get there. My husband said, we need to make a drive to Mathis and try to move those wind turbines ourselves. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work.
Rolling Blackout sounds like an R&B punk band that you may have played lead for.
Yeah, I did.
There you go.
20 years ago.
Yeah, well, when I was in my younger,
Back in
wilder
Memphis.
days. Yeah, that's right. And thanks for the plug, by the way.
There you go.
We talked a couple of weeks ago about the proposed city budget for this upcoming year. It's $3.7 billion budget, $1.6 billion general fund budget. And that budget does not include funding for SA 2020 after, I think, 9 years of the nonprofit receiving $150,000 a year. $150,000 is, I think it's 1/100th of 1% of the city general fund budget, but it's close to 30% of the SA 2020 budget. And SA 2020, for those who are not too, who don't know too much about it or haven't lived in San Antonio for a long time, this is really the byproduct of a process that Julian Castro started when he became mayor. He became mayor basically at the cusp of a new decade, and he decided in 2010, let's get a bunch of people from the community together. We'll have a series of forums, and people will break into groups, and they'll talk about what are the big goals that we have for the next, what do we want SA to look like in 2020? And we're going to, where do we stand now and how do we get there? And this nonprofit was really the final step in that process was, okay, now that we've decided what we want to do, how are we going to get there? And who's going to hold us accountable? And SA 2020 as an organization has been really good at sort of gathering data, breaking it down, analyzing it, kind of engaging with organizations in the community, kind of holding their feet to the fire, including the city of San Antonio, and saying, well, this is where we're falling short. One of the things that they've been very involved in recently, and this is really kind of one of the big interesting issues in this, is that they've gotten very outspoken on the issue of equity. And this year they supported Proposition A, which was very controversial. A lot of people in the business community were against it. Mayor Ron Nirenberg was against it. And this was the proposition that would have expanded the city's cite and release program. It also would have decriminalized abortion and small level marijuana possession. So there are thoughts within SA 2020, and Kieran Corbanes, the executive director, has suggested that this is a political move by the city because SA 2020 has been so outspoken on some of these issues. And obviously the city is saying, I think the city has now, they've got someone in-house that they want to handle data for them. And they're saying this is what
and so, it's kind of a work in progress. They don't actually even know which, what the metrics are that they're going to be following. But they're saying it's in transition. They're working it out.
Obviously, we don't know what kind of conversations were happening behind the scenes. I mean, do you see this as possibly political? Yeah,
you can't rule it out.
Yeah,
particularly given that 2 years ago, after SA 2020 also endorsed Prop B, which would have basically done away with collective bargaining rights for the police union. They came out in support of it. And then that year, just within weeks, learned that there was no funding in the proposed budget for the following fiscal year. It got worked out. They come out in support of Prop A, which is a lot of changes, proposed changes to policing policy. And as you say, it had solid majority of city council was against it. Mayor Nirenberg was against it. The city attorney said this was unenforceable. I mean, if this was adopted, there was very little the city could do to actually enact it. And in addition to that, you had the police union and the business. So everybody was against this, but this kind of small core group. SA 2020 was part of that. And I just don't think you can realistically look at what happened with their funding and say that there wasn't, there are at minimum questions. I think it probably influenced the city's decision not to give them funding.
I want to mention, when we're talking about Prop A, Kieran Corbanes of SA 2020, she wrote an op-ed for the Express News in April before the election. And in response to suggestions by people in the business community that this would see Proposition A would create a spike in crime. She said, quote, "The truth is the root causes of crime are the inequities already here." And she cited lack of health care, low wages, and so on. Carrie, we're still learning about what went on, and there's still the possibility that City Council will say, we want to reinstate that funding. What are your thoughts about this?
And we're going to Nancy and I, editorial board, the rest of the editorial board, are going to meet with SA 2020 and the city this week in meetings. So want to listen to both, but I think they've served a valuable service to the community in the ability to aggregate different city department reports and statistics, and also hold different departments in the city accountable for things like being inclusive and for being equitable. One of the things they do, they have this excellent workshop called the Board Game for nonprofits, and where they stress the importance of nonprofits being more inclusive in their board membership. And then they take in applications from people within the within the community who want to be on boards, and they try to match those people who want to serve on boards with the correct boards, all with the objective of making these boards more inclusive and looking more like San Antonio, which a lot of boards, and I'm on a couple of boards, and a lot of boards don't look like San Antonio. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's just hard to look at the optics of this after their positions on Proposition B, and especially Proposition A, and not question if it's not a little bit of, not a little bit, but of payback. I guess that's the wrong word. No payback. But it's hard not to, and again, we'll listen to both sides this week, but it's hard not to not think that there wasn't a little bit of pettiness involved.
Yeah, we have a lot to learn about it, but I mean, the city has been about equity on their funding, and I mean, they have that big plan, and then they're trying to keep that in mind. So to me, this doesn't kind of match up. It seems like not to align as well. Something seems amiss here. So we do want to find out more. I know that these numbers and these statistics, their website is used. I use it personally as a journalist. I'll just be honest. I pull it up. I look at it, the profiles for every district. I mean,
and they analyze things. They're it's
easy to understand. It saves me so much time, and I know that we can rely on it. I know that it's correct. It's accurate. And now we can go and pull the numbers from it, and we do, and we check the numbers and do things. But, I've sat in editorial board meetings with candidates, and I've pulled up the profiles of each district and seen how many people are voting and not voting, and what are the issues, and what is the poverty rate. And it just is very easy to understand. The city does have their statistics, they have dashboards and they have all these things, but you have to go digging for them. And they're not, they're just not displayed the same way that SA 2020 displays them.
Yeah, they do data visualization really well. I mean, it's very clear, you get a very strong sense of kind of where you're at in meeting the goals kind of laid out in SA 2020. I would question though, I just don't think this is not a big deal to most San Antonians. They've never heard of SA 2020. I mean, like this organization, in a sense, it's kind of a bubble thing. It means a lot to the people it means a lot to, but I don't know that it's extended its reach into the broader community. And, it's like, this is a complicated situation, I think, because, I mean, it does appear that, there's some political payback going on. That's an easy conclusion to reach. But I mean, there's also a good argument, I think, that, it's not the worst thing in the world for this organization, this nonprofit that is about transparency and accountability to not receive city funding, to have an independent source.
Completely independent,
I mean, if they're going to hold the city to account, maybe it's best not to take funding from the city. And I think it's always been in an interesting position because like I said, it was the byproduct of something that a San Antonio mayor created. And it always had this sort of partnership with the city, but it has also been independent and spoken out maybe in ways that city leadership wasn't always comfortable with.
But at least do it like in steps, not just completely pull the rug out.
The organization, I think they have 3 full-time staff members. It's very small. They get a lot of work done with a very small staff. They have started to get additional sources of revenue. They've done, I think, work for like groups like Every Texan and some other organizations to, providing data and some resources for them. So they have been, seeking and receiving some additional funding from elsewhere. But it's in the short term, it's going to be tough for them.
Right.
But I think the points you're making are good ones. I guess the final thing I would say about it is that if you think about what Julian Castro had in mind, you can sort of project a future and say, this is what we want our city to look like in 10 years and so on. But if you just kind of leave it at that and then, okay, now we're done, I think there's a piece that's missing. And I think that SE 2020 has sort of taken on the role of, we're going to be the group we're going to provide the hard truths and see, well, how are we actually doing? It's very easy to say that we want to do this, we want to improve in this area, we want to become better as a city. But if no one's really kind of looking at how we're doing and why we're not getting where we need to get.
I think your column was excellent on
Thank
it.
you.
And
Appreciate it.
especially the point about the amount of, when you look at how much they pay SA 2020, what was the amount? It was very
$150,000 a year.
150.
Yeah.
$150,000 a year is nothing to the city.
Yeah.
So if you look at it like that and really keep things in perspective, I thought that point was excellent.
Thank you so much. Well, we're going to see what happens with that. Like I said, obviously we're still a couple of weeks away from City Council voting on that. There's an issue that's gotten a lot of attention in San Antonio, and Nancy, you and Carrie have written really well about this. And we didn't get a chance to talk about it last week because we had Colin Allred on our last podcast. So this happened a week before last, but I wanted to get a chance to talk about it. Nephtalí De León, who was named the Poet Laureate of San Antonio about 4 months ago. This is a 3-year deal when you're named Poet Laureate of the city, and only 4 months into his stint, it was terminated because of a poem that he posted on Facebook on August 1st, which got a lot of criticism, and he used a Spanish word that is, I think, widely seen as like a racial slur. I'm not going to repeat it, but I guess, Nancy, I'll start with you. When you look at this situation, I mean, he's somebody he's been a part of the community for a long time. I mean, he has, I think he has a lot of friends and fans, in the local community. But there was clearly among his peers, you felt like there were a lot of people who were very upset about what he wrote. What were your thoughts about this? When
I saw that he was our new Poet Laureate, I was excited about it. I watched it. I didn't go in person, but I watched it. And I remember, and that's in my column when I used, what Mayor Nierenberg said about him. And it was just such a beautiful ceremony. I remember thinking, like, I did not know what a Chicano, like, I grew up in South Texas, but I did not know what a Chicano was until I took a class in college at Texas A&M Kingsville. Then I took this Chicano lit class and learned all about it, but we didn't learn it before that. And I was just proud, like, hey, we have this Hispanic man, he's Chicano. I mean, it was just a really bright time, and something to be proud of. But when I read that poem and then saw that he didn't apologize, I think that was the crux of what happened here. Like, he did not apologize, and he didn't see anything wrong about it. And he really someone called him out on Facebook, and it was a fellow, professor. He's a former professor and writer, author, and someone who is very, he did not want him to lose his job, first of all. But he just questioned him, like, why would you use that word, right? There are other words you can use, and using your words in your poetry to get your point across. And then instead of apologizing or learning from the moment, he just tried to justify it.
Didn't he call it a term of endearment or something, which I don't think anybody
There
really
are other
agreed with
words that would work, yes. And it's just, and I'd heard the word, growing up in South Texas, I had heard it, and I knew it was a terrible word.
You wrote, and I, if you don't mind talking about it, it was really interesting in your column when you talked about what your husband, as a police officer, his experience hearing that word. Would you mind sharing?
I had never discussed the word with my husband. It just never came up, because the last time I heard it was growing up in South Texas, near Corpus Christi and Mathis. And that's where I would hear it. It was very very negative. Basically, it was they would use the word and they would use it to describe Black people, and they would say they were lazy and worthless, basically, as employees. And that's how it was used. And they were just lazy, right? I mean, terrible racial slur and totally incorrect. So I asked my husband, because it had never come up, and I said, have you ever heard this word? And he's like, oh yeah. And then he said, I was arresting, and he grew up in Brooklyn. So I thought it's very diverse in Brooklyn, and he's told me all kind of stories from growing up there and being a police officer there as well. And I thought he was going to say there, but he said, no, the first time I heard it was in San Antonio. He was a bike officer. He was working downtown. He was arresting someone, and that person he was arresting said it. And he's like, and I said, well, did you know what it was? And he said, oh, I figured it out. He said it wasn't said with love. It was anger. It was hate. He was obviously upset about it, but he knew right away it was a racial slur. And he heard it after that, working in San Antonio for a lot of years as an officer, and he just knew what it meant, and he said, that's a terrible word. Nobody should use it in poetry at all. And you saw that. I thought what was really impressive, I was really impressed that people who support our poet laureate and love him and respect him and art and the work actually had the courage to stand up and say, this isn't right. Yeah. And they didn't attack him personally, but they attacked his actions, and they just want him to apologize, but he didn't.
Carrie, do you think that the city did the right thing by, they moved pretty quickly in saying we're gonna take this honor away from him, and do you think they handled it the right way?
At first, I thought they may have acted too quickly, but then I realized this. First of all, he's in, as of August 28th. I don't think he's said anything yet when it comes to an apology. Yeah. But he represents the city, and that's the point. As the poet laureate, he represents the city, and one of the responsibilities of the poet laureate is to speak out against racism, bigotry, any kind, any form, where they see it. Which isn't to say, and no one has said, that De León is a racist, is a bigot. When I first found out about the controversy, and I went looking to see how this all started, I think that told this to Nancy, that, my first thought was, I hope it's not the word I'm thinking of. Damn, it's the word I'm thinking of.
It's always the word.
It's always the word.
Oh,
and it's not, and you even see in the context that he uses in the poem, it's not malicious. Right. But it is the Spanish version of the N-word, which there are quite a few people in the Black community who will use it as a term of endearment. But, there are terms of endearment which can only be used by a specific group. If I can call my girlfriend baby cakes. Yeah. You can't.
Context means so much.
The N-word, though, the N-word, not the M-word. Because I've never heard the M-word with endearment at all. Only with it's
only within a group, but and part of the problem was he gave this long explanation of the etymology of the word, which was fascinating, but didn't speak to the specific meaning and hurt that word causes now. And I do think, like Nancy said, one of the most admirable things about this was it was his colleagues, it was his friends, it was Mexican-American writers and scholars like Ron Tejeda, Barbara Bernard Gonzalez, Eddie Vega, who were calling him out on it and never once calling him a racist, never once attacking him personally, and never once asking that he be fired from his job. That was no one's intent.
It seemed like they went to communicate with him why they were upset. Yeah.
And he didn't, it's like he just remained, I don't know if it was being stubborn or whatever, but he just remained silent.
When he accepted this position, you're basically an ambassador for the city at that point, right?
Yeah, I think the city did the right thing in ending the contract and firing, in effectively firing the poet laureate. Yeah. I'm kind of I'm an absolutist on kind of questions of art, and I know my position is probably not mainstream. I think the idea of a poet laureate is, I don't know. It's like to me, it's like it's government sanctioned art. That doesn't make sense. I get you. Well, so but if you're going to have it, right, and they are representing the city, then yes.
And this gets to something because I'm kind of cynical at heart too. So I often wonder.
No.
I haven't wondered. Yeah, yeah. Or maybe
I thought it was just
I didn't know it was like maybe I was unfair in grouping you in there with me and dragging you down into the mud with me. But and I'm not even talking about so much Nephtalí's his specific example. But with city and state poet laureates, sometimes you hear politicians go, and their poetry is blah blah blah, and I sometimes wonder, like, have you actually read their poetry? I mean, maybe you have, right? But I'm cynical about these.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much. The life of a poet is varied and rich, and inevitably there's going to be something objectionable. If you go through any poet's body of work, there's going to be something you object to.
And he's always been provocative. I mean, that's kind of what he's.
Oh yeah. I mean, in a way, it's like he's an activist as much as he is a poet. Yeah. I mean, it is they're really the same thing with him. So, I mean, it's in a sense like his use of the word is shocking. The fact that there was this kind of confrontation with the city is not shocking. I don't think. Yeah. It seems, in retrospect, it was probably pretty predictable that something like this could happen.
And it's not again that he used the word in a previous poem. I mean, you can go through the poetry of any of the previous poet laureates, Carmen, Jenny, Vocab, Octavio, and you can find something that's Vocab with him now. Yeah. You can find a poem, a line that's going to offend someone
if you go looking for it, right?
If you're looking for it, if you understand it. Yeah. His thing was he did it, on Facebook,
there was another poem to that point. There was another poem he had put on his Facebook just right before that, and you could go to his Facebook page and see it, but Facebook actually translated it automatically, which Facebook will do now without you even clicking to ask, the algorithms and stuff. So it'll translate it. And it did translate that
in the
word.
worst way.
Oh my God. I didn't know that.
In the worst way. Yeah.
And so it looks like he wrote that and it's quite shocking. And it's just right there for everybody to see. Even right after this, you can see it.
It's still there?
Yeah. And it's just like, come on. Like
this one you can't put on him. I mean, you could go take it out, but it wasn't the word that he wrote, but Facebook.
Yes.
In the
It was the M word, and Facebook changed it to the N word.
Which tells you a lot about Facebook's measures of standards. Checking things.
I mean, it doesn't censor, but I thought that was, and people were definitely talking about that even after the controversy.
Oh, wow. Before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk about something the editorial board wrote about, which was that SAISD schools are cutting 27 librarian and 28 family and community engagement specialist positions. And this is happening at a time when we're also seeing in Houston, the HISD has eliminated library positions at 28 schools. And they're turning some of those libraries into team centers where you have kids with behavioral issues are being sent there. So it's almost like a detention center or something like that. Just as someone, I think we're probably all, I think we all share this, that we love libraries and loved libraries, when we were in school. The highlight for me in elementary school was the one day a week when we would get to go to the library. This is just, and I understand funding issues, particularly when we're talking about SAISD. But there's something really sad about this, and it feels like wrong-headed. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So an important point that Hymek, the San Antonio ISD superintendent made right away. So it's interesting that you say the Houston ISD, the library, which is terrible. I mean, it's untenable. There's no way you can justify that. Is that this is very different than what's happening in Houston. And so he says, libraries are still open at San Antonio ISD. And so it's not that any school doesn't have a library where students can go and check out a book. But when they get to that library, some of the schools do not have an actual librarian. So they will go, if you're the teacher, you will go help them and check their books out. But they don't have the time when, like you said, most of the time, teachers go drop them off over there for a little bit or stay with them. Sometimes the librarian would actually have little lessons or teach them how to research.
You were a teacher. You saw this.
I saw that as a teacher. I mostly taught at junior high level and a little high school, but the librarians were super important with technology. So they did so much more than books, right? And so they would give devices. Yeah, there's an image there of a device. They would check that devices out. They would help teachers learn how to use them and stuff, especially during COVID. There's just so much that librarians do. So without librarians, libraries are not libraries, right? Then I find out, part of the cuts as well is, and the reason the cuts are happening is because Jaime Aquino is saying, okay, we have this pot of money for every school, and the principal is going to decide how to use that money.
That's right.
And the only requirements he gave were one nurse and one principal. That's it.
So the individual schools are making these decisions.
Yes. So the principal's making it. Now they're supposed to have a committee. It really does vary between schools, between campuses, how much that committee is involved or not involved, how communication is had, right? So we've heard about stuff like that. But basically, he's telling the principals, you make this decision and you make the hard choices, and then you deal with the fallout. And what our editorial board said on that is that Jaime needs to make those decisions, and that every school should have a librarian, in their school. So not just a library. And just to find a way to make that happen. And yes, we understand, budgets they are underfunded. And we write about that often. Everybody does. The other part of this is that, they have engagement specialists, parent engagement specialists, and those were cut as well. And so by some of the principals, right? So it was like 28 at each school, 28 overall for each one. So social, engagement specialists, and then the librarians. And so those were cut. So it just kind of depends when they showed up at school recently, to start the new school year, are those people there or not? And so it's being felt at schools. It's a hard problem to have. Part of it is he said it was a precursor to the downsizing that's happening, or the planning that's happening for the downsizing. But what like the local teacher alliance is saying for San Antonio ISD is, well, you haven't even started this yet. You're just starting the planning, and yet you're already cutting. And when I asked him, I said, well, once this is done and you close some of the schools, you consolidate some of them, does that mean that every school will then have a librarian and an engagement specialist? And he said, no, not necessarily. And I know that Jaime, he wants the most and the best for the campuses, but I just think that they need to work on how to better balance the decision making with what's there, and just put better guardrails up so that it is more equitable for students. Because if you're going to Bonham and I'm going to Hawthorne and you have a library and I don't, the parent, a lot of parents just gonna say, I'm going to get them out. I'm going to take them to a charter school. So it's a tough,
hard choices. But I mean, Carrie, when you think about, librarians and what they mean and libraries and schools,
I understand, of course, the two where he keeps control of the principal and a nurse, but a librarian should be the third one. It just seems that should be his decision, and to me, it's kind of a cop out not to take responsibility for that and put it up on the principals.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Well, we're going to wrap things up there. I want to thank everybody for listening. Hope everyone's doing well, and we'll be back soon. Take care.